Hi students, this is the last video in preparation for the unit test, and perhaps for me it is one of the more important ones because we're actually looking at what we're supposed to learn and what we're supposed to be able to do with that information. So we start off with our essential knowledge statements that biological systems from cells to populations to ecosystems are affected by biotic and abiotic interactions that involve the exchange of matter and free energy. Right here. And so we talked about a lot of these things. We talked about how cell activities are affected by interactions with biotic and abiotic factors, as we talked about temperature affecting coral reefs. So temperature is an abiotic factor, and pH in that case was an abiotic factor. And then the biotic part was the part about the lack of trees and such due to deforestation, that disrupting the carbon cycle along with human interaction. So we've talked about how cell activities are affected by both living and non-living factors. We've talked about how organism activities are affected by interactions with abiotic and biotic factors. Once again, as we talked about our coral reef simulation, we talked about the effects of temperature and pH, and we'll hit many of these along the way as the year continues. We talked about predator-prey relationships, right? How perhaps something like a disease could come out and knock your predator out, which would affect the relationship. We talked about perhaps human interaction, humans coming and destroying habitat. That could take out a prey item. So again, it's always about the interactions between the living and the non-living things in the environment. Also, the stability of populations and ecosystems and communities is affected by these interactions. So once again, we've spent a lot of time talking about biodiversity, how it's important, how there needs to be a lot of different kinds of species to interact, to provide resilience to the community so that it can bounce back in the event of some sort of environmental change. We've talked about the interactions that occur in food chains and food webs, right? Not necessarily just the biotic factors of organisms eating organisms, but also the cycling of nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen through the food chains as well, and those are abiotic factors. We've talked about the role of the nitrogen cycle in the formation of algal blooms, right? Through eutrophication, we get a buildup of nitrogen, and that can increase the density of population of algae. And of course, we know the effect there could be eventually a dead zone. So we've covered all of this kind of stuff here. And things you're supposed to be able to do, I think for this test most importantly, be able to analyze data to identify possible patterns or relationships between a particular biotic factor or abiotic factor and the biological system itself. Be able to look at a graph and say what's happening. We've also gone on to discuss about disruptions of biological systems and their homeostasis. So we just today talked about invasive species and how they can disrupt homeostasis in organisms by taking their food or taking their nesting sites. We've definitely talked about the role of human impact in climate change and how we've disrupted the carbon cycle. We've also seen the role of natural disasters, as in the case of secondary succession. It is a disruption to the homeostasis, and secondary succession, is kind of a step in moving back towards homeostasis as the environment tries to restore itself. So the big objective here is to be able to use representations or models to analyze the effects of the disruptions to homeostasis, to be able to say what's happening, why it's happening, what are the effects, right? What are the effects of this disruption? Okay, moving on. We've talked about communities and how they're made of populations that interact in complex ways. And so our structure of our community is based and measured on the species diversity. And we've talked about how there are a number of models that we can use to see these interactions. So we did a predator-prey model. We've talked about symbiosis. We talked about introduced species and how they can actually become invasive. And then we also did the global climate change model with our coral reef simulation. We've also used mathematical models and graphical representations to illustrate population growth. For instance, we talked about exponential growth, right? We've talked about logistic growth. Where is that? There you go, the logistic growth model. We've talked about density-dependent and density-independent limiting factors and how they can shape the size of a population. We have not talked about this yet. That was that number 15 that I asked you to take off the study guide. We've not talked about that. But again, we know that if an organism reproduces, as we talked about, like as in trophic cascades, if they over-reproduce, they can start stripping the ecosystem of resources, overpopulate, and that can really be a problem. That's kind of related here. So basically, what are they going to be asking you here for? What kinds of questions? Predict the effects of a change in the community's populations on the population, or be able to use mathematical routines to quantities that describe communities composed of populations that interact. We then talked about variation in a population and how being able to respond to changes in the environment is a function of genetic diversity. And so if there's little genetic diversity, a population and a species might be at risk for extinction. So in particular, we've only talked about Tasmanian devils, but I will talk about potato blight later. Again, when it comes to genetic diversity, that's the key to responding to changes in the environment, and not all of us have the same genes, and so we may not all respond equally to a particular change in the environment. And so we've talked about the case of infectious diseases, like the Spanish flu, like the Black Plague, like HIV, how some people naturally are more resistant to those things, and they've been survivors historically. In the case of the flu and the bubonic plague, leading to the continuation of our species. Next, we've talked about individuals acting on information and communicating it to others. Just briefly, we've mentioned it as we've talked about the pheromones produced by the Africanized bees. Those are not really predator warnings, but it kind of fits into this category right here. And this is something that we'll talk about more and later during the year. But what we did talk about under this particular essential knowledge statement is colony and swarming behavior in insects. Again, that actually is a cooperative behavior that increases the fitness of not only the individual but the survival of the population. Again, that beehive has baby bees in there, and of course that's what the bees are trying to protect as they swarm. So that again is increasing the fitness of the individual and of the population. We've talked a little bit about parent and offspring interactions as relates to parental care and how that can help offspring survive longer with that type 1 survival curve. So again, things that you should be able to do: be able to describe how organisms exchange information, be able to analyze data, be able to create a representation that describes how organisms exchange information in response to internal changes and how it can change their behavior. Moving on, we've talked about the interactions between and within populations influencing the patterns of species distribution and abundance. We've talked about competition and how organisms may have to compete for resources. We've talked about parasitism harming a host, predator-prey relationships, as well as mutualism and commensalism. Okay. When we did the trophic cascade model, the click and learn, we were able to determine whether certain interactions were positive or negative. We modeled that on our click and learn. And we've also talked about predator-prey relationships and symbiosis as well, invasive included. We've talked about the loss of keystone species and how an environmental catastrophe such as that can affect the species distribution and abundance. So remember, when you lose that keystone species in some way, it can really impact those lower trophic levels as they have no more control on their population growth. And then just today we talked about kudzu, and without competition or any kind of predation, kudzu here in the United States can reproduce uncontrolled. Moving on, we talked about use of energy, and we said that everybody's got to have energy, And if you don't have free energy, then you will die. And we'll talk more about how we use energy, but we did talk about one use of energy, and that was in reproduction and rearing of offspring. And so we related that actually to our R versus K strategies. More on this when we go into energy and enzymes. Take-home points. Changes in the producer level definitely can affect the number and size of other trophic levels, as we all depend on producers. And if you were to change an energy source, such as the sunlight, like let's say there was a volcanic eruption, and ash clouded the atmosphere, blocking the sunlight, it could definitely impact the producers, not only their numbers, but the biomass, and of course the lack of producers could then affect other trophic levels as well. Let's see. We're on 5, sorry. Here we go. Energy flows, but matter is recycled. So here we talked about nitrogen cycle and carbon cycle and phosphorus cycle. We talked about interactions between food chains and food webs. We talked about, again, competition, the logistic growth model, competition for resources, predation, density-dependent population regulation. Many adaptations of organisms are related to obtaining and using energy, and we just saw that today with the honey badger and the Africanized bees. Their particular behavioral adaptation is used to help them survive in their highly chaotic environment. So we should be able to use visual representations. We should be able to predict the effects of change on a community. Going on, we talked about the human impact, human activities, impact ecosystems on local, regional, and global scales. So definitely we've talked about it in terms of introducing species and global climate change and all the things we've been mentioning that we are doing wrong. Okay, and so this human impact has reduced population sizes of certain species, resulted in habitat destruction, and even extinction of species. And we will talk more about that as we go through the evolution chapter. We're getting close to the end. We've talked about slash and burn and how that can accelerate change at the local and global climate level. So again, we've talked about increasing CO2 as a result of urbanization and slash and burn agriculture. Finally, we talked about how changes, geologic changes can impact populations. And so this goes back to that first continental drift activity that we did when we looked at the biomes, how they're currently distributed. And we'll revisit this again as we talk about evolution. But again, continental drift explains how those continents got to where they are, and then we can explain the distribution of biomes based on the distribution of those continents in space on the Earth. And then finally, diversity of a species influences the stability of the ecosystem. We've already said the fewer parts, the less diversity, the less resilient to changes in the environment, the weaker that particular ecosystem. And we've also talked about keystone species, how they might not necessarily be the most abundant, but they are the most important. And so when they're removed from an ecosystem, that can actually cause the collapse of the ecosystem. So again, we should be able to make claims and predictions about how species diversity influences ecosystem stability. So that gives you an idea of how we're covering the material, where it fits in, and that is that.